James Hervey Pratt, a Wild West frontiersman in our community. A presentation by the Bennington Historical Society. We have show and tell periods at the end of our Historical Society meetings when members share or show interesting and unusual historical gems. A couple of years ago, Scott Japp brought a copy of Colonel James Pratt's 1910 obituary. It read like a Wild West novel. Colonel Pratt's exploits put him in the middle of the Sioux Indian Wars of the 1870s and the Black Hills Gold Rush. Later, he moved his business headquarters to Omaha, and he built an amazing estate on State Street called Summerhill Farm. We'd like to share a little of what we've learned about Colonel Pratt's remarkable life and Summerhill Farm. We believe you'll enjoy it. James Hervey Pratt was born in Plainfield, Massachusetts in 1825. He married Louise Field in 1855. She was the first cousin to the famous Marshall Field of Chicago retail fame. They had two daughters, Harriet Bell and Margaret Louise. He served as a Union quartermaster in the Civil War and reached the rank of colonel before mustering out of the service in 1866. In 1870, he was appointed post trader at Fort Randall in Dakota Territory by President Grant. He held that position for 8 years. During that time, he received government contracts to supply beef and supplies to the Army and to the Red Cloud and Spotted Tail Indian reservations. He started to raise cattle in Nebraska in 1873 to supply that beef. During this time at Fort Randall, he met and became friends with Cornelius Farris, and the two became partners and formed the Pratt and Farris Company. The partners left Fort Randall and headed to western Nebraska, where they set up their business headquarters in Sidney. There they created a freight hauling business which operated from 1873 to 1886. Their headquarters was set up next to the Union Pacific Railroad line, and from there they hauled supplies to the remote areas of the Nebraska Panhandle and what was then Dakota Territory. Gold was discovered in Deadwood late in 1875, and their freight business boomed due to the gold rush. In a very short time, they were operating 70 freight wagons. Each could carry 8,000 pounds of supplies. These wagons were pulled by teams of horses or mules, and some teams were made up with as many as 8 animals or more. And they hauled more than 9 million pounds of freight in 1876 alone. Freighting was hard work, and the trail was dangerous in the 1870s. The Great Sioux War broke out in 1876 with Custer's Last Stand happening in June of that year. Drivers lived on sow belly, beans, and coffee. Freighters traveled in groups called trains for protection. However, many were killed by Indians and white marauders who would steal and resell their supplies. For example, there was a notorious stretch of trail through Red Canyon, South Dakota, that was perfect for ambushes. Drivers called it the Valley of Death because of the number of drivers killed there. Pratt's involvement in these harrowing events was never recorded, but he was renowned for his thrilling stories. Undoubtedly, he experienced them. The freight business began to decline in 1879 with the expansion of the railroad further north. The partners diversified, forming the Pratt and Farris Cattle Company in 1880. They and 3 other investors from Chicago invested heavily in land and cattle. They bought several large ranches in Texas, Nebraska, and Wyoming, which included the 20,000-acre U-Cross and the Big Red ranches in Wyoming. The Big Red Ranch became their headquarters. The colonel moved his headquarters from Sydney to Omaha in 1898 and became active in local business. He bought into the Omaha Anchor Fence Company and became the company's president. The company produced fencing supplies and barbed wire, which was being used to fence the country. The colonel also served as president of the Arlington National Bank and as director of the Union Stockyards in South Omaha. The Union Stockyards had originally started as a feeding and watering stop for livestock heading east by rail. However, by 1892, the stockyards had expanded to contain the largest meat processing plant in the world that had more than 5,000 employees. They processed nearly 1 million head of livestock a year. The colonel's immense land holdings included farmland just 3 miles south of the current site of Bennington. His initial purchase of 160 acres grew to an estate of nearly 1,600 acres, initially named the Pratt Ranch. However, the name eventually changed to Summerhill Farm because it was his summer retreat. He spent more and more time there, and eventually it became his full-time home. The estate was a showcase for modern agricultural practices at that time. It's rumored the property was toured by the United States Secretary of Agriculture. There were 2 stately homes. This photo is of the main house, and these are probably family members and friends. The family had a uniquely large barn with a flat roof that supported a flagpole. The barn contained over 40 stalls to accommodate the number of horses they needed to farm with. The teams had to be switched to give them rest, and during harvest it wasn't uncommon for 8 or 10 loads of grain to be hauled by horse-drawn wagons to Elkhorn to be sold. The farm also raised hogs and cattle. The farm crew could number up to 20, especially during harvest. This was when corn was picked by hand, not by machines. Workers were housed in large barracks. The colonel's son-in-law, Henry Magee, and his sons, Jerome and Wayland, helped the colonel manage the Pratt and Farris properties in his later years. The colonel died at home in 1910, and the estate was taken over by his son-in-law, Henry Magee, and his sons. Wayland Magee took up photography as a hobby, leaving behind an important collection of century-old images of farm life in our community. Let's enjoy a few while we consider how much farming practices have changed. We want to thank the Wayland Magee family for sharing their rich history and the many images shown here. You can learn more about this amazing Bennington resident from the Nebraska Historical Society and these other resources. Thank you very much.